Hello everyone, this is Robin Warder, and I'm guessing that some of you might be surprised to see a new Trail Went Cold episode suddenly pop up in your feed on a Saturday, so I think I should provide a brief explanation. As I'm sure you know, we are currently experiencing a global pandemic with the coronavirus, which is keeping most people indoors and has canceled many forms of entertainment, so we felt that the least we could do for our listeners is provide some additional entertainment and release a surprise bonus episode. The episode you're about to hear was released exclusively to our Patreon feed nearly 2 years ago, right after we launched on the platform, so only a handful of people have ever heard it. And if you're not in the mood for anything dark right now and need a break from true crime, you're in luck, because this episode is about the life and career of the legendary Robert Stack. It's actually one of my favorite episodes we've ever produced, so I'm glad that more people will finally get to hear it. Anyway, I hope you all remain safe and healthy out there, and enjoy the episode.
November 29th, 1987. Millions of people tune into NBC to watch a TV special about unsolved mysteries, which is hosted by a legendary, well-respected Hollywood actor. The special is eventually turned into a full-time television series, and this actor becomes the permanent host. 3 decades later, after this TV show and the host have become pop culture icons, they inspire a true crime podcast called The Trail Went Cold. Somewhere, someone has accessed a special Patreon episode for this podcast. Perhaps that someone is listening. Perhaps it's you. Hello everyone, this is Robin Warder, and welcome to The Trail Went Cold's first official bonus episode on Patreon. We thank you so much for supporting our podcast, and in order for these special bonus episodes to stand out from our usual weekly content, I thought it would be a good time to experiment a little bit and present something a little different from the norm. Instead of covering an unsolved mystery in this particular episode, I'm going to talk about the voice behind unsolved mysteries, Robert Stack. We've talked about him quite a bit in our Trail Went Cold Facebook discussion group, and some of our listeners expressed an interest in hearing a podcast episode about Mr. Stack's life, so here we are. This isn't going to be a definitive biography, but rather an informal discussion about some of the most interesting aspects of his life, and I'll hopefully share some neat tidbits about him that you didn't know before. Now, they often say you should never become too enamored with celebrities, because you'll inevitably become disappointed when you discover that they're not as good a person as their public image would suggest. But Robert Stack is one of those rare celebrities who seem to be almost unanimously regarded by everyone who knew him as an all-around great human being. So if you're looking for dirt or scandalous stories, this probably isn't going to be the podcast episode for you. I think it goes without saying that Mr. Stack was a major influence on me and The Trail Went Cold in general. I have my doubts that Unsolved Mysteries would have become as popular as it was if he hadn't been hired to be the host, because he just enhanced the show so much with his awesome voice and presence. I first started watching Unsolved Mysteries in late 1988 when the show was just starting out, and I was around 10 years old. I would definitely say that the stern-looking, square-jawed, spooky-sounding guy in the trench coat played a large role in drawing me in. Of course, at that point, I had no idea who Robert Stack was, and was completely unaware that he'd had a distinguished career in Hollywood for nearly 50 years. He was nearing the age of 70 when he signed on to become the full-time host, and I'm guessing he never would have predicted that the show would become the thing he was most known for and define his legacy. To give you an idea what an impression he made, even though I forget my own phone number half the time, I can still recite the phone number for the Unsolved Mysteries Telecenter by heart. If you have any information about this story, please call our toll-free number 1-800-876-5353. Anyway, before we talk about Unsolved Mysteries, let's go back to the beginning of his life and examine his career as a whole. And incidentally, since Robert Stack's friends always called him Bob, I'm going to be very informal and refer to him as Bob from now on. Anyway, Bob was originally born in Los Angeles on January 13th, 1919, but his birth name was actually Charles Langford Modini Stack. That's the name his mother Elizabeth liked, but his father, James Langford Stack, preferred the name Robert and decided to change it. Incidentally, the Modini part of his name came from his maternal grandfather, who was an opera singer named Charles Wood, but since he often performed in Italy, he decided to change his professional name to an Italian one, Carlo Modini, in order to further his career over there. Pretty much the entire maternal side of Bob's family were opera singers, including his mother, uncle, and both of his grandparents. And here's an interesting piece of trivia about Bob's father. You may have heard the slogan for Schlitz beer, the beer that made Milwaukee famous. Well, James Langford Stack was an advertising executive, and he came up with that slogan. Bob had quite an unusual upbringing, especially for the 1920s, as his parents divorced when he was only a year old, and his mother decided to move to Paris to study opera and raise her son. For this reason, Bob actually started out learning how to speak French and Italian, and did not learn to speak English until he moved back to America at age 7. Bob's parents eventually reconciled and got remarried, but his father died when he was 10, so Bob and his older brother, James Jr., would once again be raised by a single mother. Elizabeth wanted her son to have male role models in his life, so she encouraged Bob to get into sports, and he managed to achieve some level of fame during his teen years before he broke into acting. Bob and his brother James got into powerboat racing, and they managed to win the International Outboard Motor Championships in Venice, Italy, and remain champions in America for 3 years. However, Bob's biggest skill was in skeet shooting, as he turned out to be an incredibly gifted marksman. At age 16, he became a member of the All-American Skeet team and eventually won the National Skeet Shooting Championship. He went on to set 2 world records and would be elected to the National Skeet Shooting Hall of Fame. In fact, if you search Robert Stack's name on YouTube, one of the very first clips you'll find is titled Robert Stack, Skeet Shooter Extraordinaire. It's a great piece of footage from the 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles, where Bob shows the famous tennis player, Arthur Ashe, how to skeet shoot. Since Bob's maternal family was involved in show business, he frequently hung out with big Hollywood stars during his youth who would often visit his home. Actors like Clark Gable and Spencer Tracy would take him hunting and fishing or play polo with him and act as surrogate father figures since Bob's father had passed away. Bob remembered developing the biggest crush on Hollywood starlet Carole Lombard when she was a house guest at his home when he was a teenager. Once he reached adulthood, he decided to study drama at the University of Southern California and started some singing lessons which were not going well. Bob always joked that even though his mother's side of the family were all opera singers, he had the misfortune to inherit his father's singing voice. Bob's music tutor made an arrangement to take him on a tour of the Universal Studios lot and visit the set of a movie starring one of Hollywood's biggest musical stars at that time, Deanna Durbin. Bob's tutor wanted him to study Deanna sing in order to better himself, but the whole experience turned out to be an unexpected big break for him. While hanging around the set, Bob, being a pretty good-looking guy in his youth, caught the attention of producer Joe Pasternak, who thought he would be the perfect candidate to play the male lead in an upcoming Deanna Durbin film and asked him to audition. Bob did so, and at the age of 20, he secured his first role in a 1939 musical comedy called First Love. Now, Bob always joked that he hated telling the story because it gave off the false impression that it was very easy to break into the movie business. I mean, he pretty much lived the ultimate fantasy scenario of being discovered by a major Hollywood producer who instantly gave him the second biggest role in a movie alongside one of Hollywood's most popular stars. Needless to say, it usually does not happen that way. Anyway, First Love was essentially a modernized retelling of Cinderella with Deanna Durbin as Cinderella and Robert Stack in the Prince Charming role. Somewhere, someone out there is missing a glass slipper. Perhaps that someone is watching. Okay, I'll stop now. The role wound up garnering a ton of publicity because he gave Deanna Durbin, who was transitioning from teenage to adult roles, her very first on-screen kiss, which was a pretty big deal at that time. This helped jumpstart Bob's career, and he wound up getting his next role in a drama called The Mortal Storm, which was quite a contrast to the lightweight First Love. I've actually seen this film, and believe it or not, you get to see Robert Stack play a member of the Hitler Youth. The film's story takes place in Germany in 1933, right after the Nazis have come into power. Jimmy Stewart plays the anti-Nazi protagonist, while Bob plays a supporting role as a young man who is seduced by the Nazi party and joins up with them. It was produced by MGM, and since the US had yet to enter World War II at that time, it was one of the first Hollywood films to tackle the issue of Nazism. In fact, Hitler became so angry about the movie's anti-Nazi message that he no longer allowed MGM films to be released in Germany. Regardless, Bob drew acclaim for his dramatic performance, and his career continued to take off. 2 years later, he started another World War II film, this one a comedy titled To Be or Not to Be, about a troupe of actors in Nazi-occupied Poland who use their skills to help the Polish resistance. The film is listed at number 49 on the American Film Institute's top 100 funniest movies of all time, and apparently, Hitler didn't like this one too much either. Now, I don't know how much truth there is to this, but it's rumored that Bob and some of the other people who were involved in such anti-Nazi films as The Mortal Storm and To Be or Not to Be wound up being placed by Der Fuhrer on a Nazi hit list. So yes, it seems that the only person in the world who did not like Robert Stack was literally Hitler. Anyway, Bob considered To Be or Not to Be one of his favorite roles because he got to act alongside his biggest childhood crush. In the film, Bob played a Polish airman who got involved in a love triangle with 2 actors played by Jack Benny and Carole Lombard. When Bob was just a teenager, Carole Lombard visited his home, and he thought she was pretty much the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, so he was thrilled to finally get the chance to star in a movie with her. However, the experience was bittersweet, because 1 month before the film was released, Carole was killed in a plane crash while returning home from a war bond rally. It was a pretty devastating experience for Bob, not only because he adored Carole, but because she was married at the time to his mentor, Clark Gable. I mentioned earlier that because Bob's father passed away at a young age, a number of Hollywood stars acted as surrogate father figures to him during his youth, but Clark Gable was the most influential, and took Bob under his wing when he started out in Hollywood, and taught him a lot about professionalism. When he learned Bob was becoming an actor, Clark sat him down and said, quote, "If you ever become a thing called a celebrity, a word I hate, use that power to help people. If you ever become a celebrity and use that power to push people around, I'm going to kick you right in the ass." End quote. And you can tell those words really stuck with him. By Bob's own admission, he did not have a rags to riches story. Even though he went through the tragedy of losing his father at a young age, he came from a well-to-do family, and since he was literally handed a leading role by a Hollywood producer, he never had to pay his dues or struggle to break into acting. So all things considered, it's quite remarkable that success never went to Bob's head. Anyway, throughout his career, Bob would amass a resume of nearly 100 film and television credits, and I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I want to make a brief mention of one of the most obscure titles you'll find on his IMDb page. During World War II, It wasn't uncommon for big-name Hollywood stars to appear in short propaganda films about supporting the war effort, and in 1943, Bob appeared in a 10-minute short called Keeping Fit. He plays an aircraft factory worker who passes out on the job because the only thing he had for breakfast was coffee and a donut. Bob proceeds to get lectured by a doctor over his poor nutrition and fitness habits because dagnammit, if you don't keep fit, you can't manufacture airplanes for our boys overseas. Oh, and Bob also plays a large chunk of his role shirtless, and you can see why he was considered a major heartthrob back then.
What did you have for dinner last night?
A sandwich and a cup of coffee.
And you got to bed about 2.
I think it was closer to 3:30, sir.
So you overslept this morning, grabbed a donut and a cup of coffee, ate it on the run, and made it through the gate just ahead of the whistle.
Afraid that's just about it, sir.
Stack, you're laying down on the job.
What do you mean? Last month I turned out more work than anybody else in the line.
But this morning you fell behind. And you'll keep doing less and less if you don't take care of yourself. You've got to keep fit. You work hard, Stack, and part of your job is keeping fit. Each individual can contribute to his own health protection and improvement by adopting a few simple ways of healthful living. Each of us must accept this responsibility and stick to it with a firm purpose. The best time to cure an illness is before it happens, by eating the right foods, doing the right things for recreation. With doctors going into the service every day, the rest of us are going to have all we can do to handle the really serious cases. And when you workers become ill, you not only hold up production, but you require medicines and doctor's services that are more urgently needed by the armed forces.
Well, what am I supposed to do to keep fit?
I think the general manager will answer that question for you at the noon meeting.
A number of other Hollywood stars pop up in this short, including Broderick Crawford and Lon Chaney Jr., and given the time period, the film also takes a few minutes to lecture housewives about attending quote-unquote government cooking schools because it's their responsibility to feed their husbands in order to ensure they keep fit. I shared Keeping Fit in my Facebook discussion group a while back, and you can watch the whole thing on YouTube if you're inclined. In case you're wondering, Bob did go overseas to serve as an aerial gunnery officer and gunnery instructor in the Navy during World War II and received a number of medals. And during this time period, Bob also became friends with a handsome young man named John F. Kennedy, and they even briefly shared an apartment in Hollywood. According to Bob, they technically weren't roommates, they would both just use the apartment from time to time when they had female companionship. In 1952, Bob became a part of film history when he starred in Buona Devil, the first ever feature-length color 3D movie produced by Hollywood. The film covered the building of Africa's first railroad during the early 20th century, which is constantly interrupted by a pair of man-eating lions. As a standalone movie, it was pretty forgettable, but it became a box office hit because of the 3D effects, which made it seem like lions were leaping out of the screen to attack the audience. When Bob attended the film's premiere, he said that people were legitimately terrified by the 3D effects, and some of them even fainted. But this created a lot of buzz for the film, and because of its box office success, a ton of 3D movies would be released during the 1950s. Of course, if you hate the overabundance of 3D films being released in theaters today, I guess you can blame Robert Stack. Anyway, let's flash forward to 1956 for what is probably Bob's most notable film role, because it actually garnered him an Academy Award nomination. The film in question was a melodrama called Written on the Wind, directed by Douglas Sirk, and starring Rock Hudson and Lauren Bacall. Stack plays a wealthy alcoholic playboy from a Texas oil family who is married to Bacall's character, but goes into a rage because he can't conceive a child with her because of a low sperm count and impotence issues. Douglas Sirk wanted the movie to reveal that Bob's character was gay and secretly in love with Rock Hudson's character, but because the motion picture production code prevented that sort of thing back in 1956, the film could only imply this. Of course, there's an awful lot of subtext here since Rock Hudson always had to conceal that he was secretly gay throughout his career. Bob and Rock worked on several films together and remained lifelong friends, and it's worth mentioning that when it was revealed that Rock was suffering from AIDS in 1985, Bob was one of the very first celebrities to publicly express his support for him. Following Rock's death, Bob stated, quote, "I think it is pretty unfortunate that some people will not accept Rock because of his honesty. He has always been a class act. By openly disclosing his condition, he has shown that he is also quite selfless." End quote. Anyway, Written on the Wind earned Bob an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor, and he was considered to be the favorite to win, but the award ultimately went to Anthony Quinn for his performance in the movie Lust for Life. At the time, Bob was a contract player at 20th Century Fox and had been loaned to Universal International in order to appear in Written on the Wind. He believed that Fox purposely organized some block voting against him in the category because they didn't want one of their contract players winning an Oscar while starring in a film made by another studio. But a big-name actress may also have influenced the Academy. In 1980, Bob released an autobiography named Straight Shooting, and when discussing his Academy Award loss, he mentioned an actress whom he only referred to as Deirdre. After Written on the Wind, Bob was up for the lead role in another film, but Deirdre apparently refused to work with him and started a negative whisper campaign against him, which may have played a role in him not winning the Oscar. Bob dropped enough hints about Deirdre in the book to make people suspect she was Ava Gardner. In a 1999 interview you can find on YouTube, Bob finally did confirm it was her and referred to Ava as a quote-unquote pain in the ass. The story goes that Ava's vendetta against Bob originated shortly after he had starred in a movie called The Bullfighter and the Lady. For some reason, Ava seemed to find the whole concept of bullfighting to be a turn-on and invited Bob back to her house for drinks. She started talking about the concept of shared sex and implied that another couple who was into sexual foursomes were possibly coming over later that evening. Well, according to Bob, he suddenly came down with a bout of the flu or food poisoning and abruptly left, and since Ava took that as him rejecting her romantic advances, she apparently held a grudge against him for years. So that's pretty much the closest thing you're going to find to a scandal in Robert Stack's career. Anyway, for years, Bob was considered to be one of the most sought-after bachelors in Hollywood, and claimed that he could never envision himself getting married, but then he fell head over heels in love with a young actress named Rosemary Bowe. On January 24, 1956, Bob and Rosemary got married, and they would remain together for the next 47 years. By all accounts, they were the absolute perfect couple who were soulmates in every conceivable way. Just watch any clips of Bob and Rosemary being interviewed together, and you can just tell that they truly loved each other. The couple would have 2 children, a daughter named Elizabeth, and a son named Charles. Unfortunately, Bob was not present when his daughter was born, because he was off filming a movie with Rock Hudson called The Tarnished Angels. However, when Rock found out about Elizabeth's birth, he decided to reveal the news to Bob by arranging for a stunt pilot to fly over the set with a banner which read, "It's a girl." And speaking of Robert Stack's family, you might be interested to know that Saturday Night Live cast member Taran Killam is actually his great-nephew, since Rosemary's sister was Taran's grandmother. And as a kid, one of Taran's earliest acting jobs was in an Unsolved Mysteries reenactment. You might remember the World War II-era Lost Love segment about a German boy named Fritz Winken, whose cabin was visited on Christmas Eve by both German and American soldiers, who all decided to put their differences aside and sit down to have a Christmas dinner with Fritz and his mother. Well, Taran Killam played young Fritz during the reenactment. Anyway, Bob made the move to television in 1959 by taking what turned out to be his most famous role at that point, portraying the iconic Prohibition agent Eliot Ness in the TV series The Untouchables. Of course, Ness was best known for being the ultimate straight-arrow crime fighter who brought down Al Capone in Prohibition-era Chicago during the 1930s, and his memoir, The Untouchables, was published following his death in 1957. Since television was still a relatively new medium, Bob was reluctant to take the role, feeling that it would be a major step down for an established movie star. However, Bob's agent insisted he take the role, and The Untouchables turned out to be a major success. The series ran for 4 seasons, and Bob drew much acclaim for his portrayal of Ness, and Ness's widow even wrote him to say that he did justice to her husband. The role earned Bob an Emmy for Best Actor in 1960, and that very same year, he also happened to receive a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And while I'm a big fan of the Brian De Palma directed movie version of The Untouchables, it goes without saying that Robert Stack was a much more convincing Eliot Ness than Kevin Costner. For a long time, Bob resisted the urge to revisit the role, though he did finally agree to play Ness one more time in a 1991 made-for-TV movie called The Return of Eliot Ness. Some footage of Bob from the Untouchables TV series was actually shown on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, when they did a segment about Ness's attempts to catch the Cleveland torso murderer, an unidentified serial killer who killed and dismembered a dozen victims during the 1930s.
You know, for some reason, I don't know why, I thought there was something more to you. Well, there isn't. You're just like every other hoodlum in those files over there. The only one out of life is a $100 suit and a roll of bills in their pocket. You give any one of them something longer than the menu to read and they'd be lost. You talk to them about God or country, friendship, love, family. They don't even know what you're talking about.
Turn around.
All they got are their guns. No hearts, no guts, just guns. If they had anything else, anything, they'd know that whatever you get from that roll of bills in your pocket, you give 20 times as much back right down to your soul.
Turn around!
Now, some of you may not know this, but Robert Stack does have a personal connection to a very infamous unsolved mystery from Hollywood. You might be familiar with the case of Jean Spangler, a 26-year-old actress who vanished without a trace after leaving her home in Los Angeles on the evening of October 7, 1949. 2 days later, her purse was discovered in Griffith Park containing a letter which read, quote, "Kirk, can't wait any longer. Going to see Dr. Scott. It will work best this way while Mother is away." End quote. Well, since Jean had recently worked as an extra on a Kirk Douglas film called Young Man with a Horn, there was much speculation that he was the Kirk mentioned in the note, and that Jean was planning to see this Dr. Scott to get an illegal abortion. Well, Kirk Douglas maintained that he barely knew Jean and was never connected to her disappearance. But here's how Robert Stack fits into the whole thing. Bob actually knew Jean and was friends with her, though I don't think they ever dated or anything. 2 nights before Jean disappeared, Bob was walking home when he happened to pass by Jean's apartment and saw an unidentified person lurking outside who looked like they might be attempting a break-in. It was too dark for Bob to get a good look at this person, or even determine if they were a man or a woman, but they took off when they saw Bob staring at them. Bob didn't really think anything of it at the time, but when Jean went missing, he came forward and shared this story with the police. Now, I have no idea if this unidentified person had anything to do with Jean's disappearance, so if Bob had gone to the police immediately, who knows if that would have even changed anything. While Bob never publicly talked about the experience, I've always wondered if he had Jean's case on his mind when he accepted the hosting gig on Unsolved Mysteries all those decades later. Knowing the story, I now wish the show had produced a segment about Jean Spangler's disappearance. Anyway, like a lot of actors who star in hit TV series, Bob became so associated with the role of Eliot Ness after The Untouchables that it was more difficult for him to find many non-law enforcement roles once the series ended. So now we'll fast forward to an altogether different phase of his career, when he played Rex Kramer in the 1980 comedy classic Airplane. I'm sure you know that Airplane was a parody of disaster films. The plot was modeled after a 1957 disaster movie called 0 Hour, and the genre had become extremely popular during the 1970s with such films as the Airport series. The idea behind Airplane was that they would cast actors who were not known for doing comedy and have them play the most absurd material with a completely straight face. If they pretended they were still acting in a serious drama, that would only make the whole thing even funnier. Of course, up until he starred in Airplane, Leslie Nielsen was known primarily for being a serious actor, but this role helped him go on to become one of the most beloved comedic actors of all time. Well, Robert Stack seemed like an ideal choice to be a part of the cast because he once acted alongside John Wayne in a 1954 disaster movie called The High and the Mighty. In that film, Bob played the captain of a passenger plane which experiences engine troubles during the flight, and John Wayne played his first officer, who has to prevent Bob's character from losing his nerve and help him make a successful emergency landing. Well, in Airplane, the character of Rex Kramer is essentially the John Wayne role, as he has to guide the film's hero, Ted Stryker, into safely landing a doomed aircraft, so the filmmakers thought casting Robert Stack as Kramer would be a nice callback to The High and the Mighty. They also believed that it would be hilarious to see Bob, an actor who had never really done comedy before, play the ridiculous material as if it was a serious drama. Even though this movie was a goofy comedy, the filmmakers just told Bob to do the role as if he was playing Elliot Ness again. And once Bob figured out what style of humor they were going for, he totally nailed it.
Loneliness, that's the bottom line. I was never happy as a child. Christmas, Ted, what does that mean to you? For me, it was a living hell. You know what it's like to fall in the mud and get kicked in the head by an iron boot? Of course you don't. No one does. It never happens. Sorry, Ted, it's a dumb question. Skip that.
Now, if there's one thing that's clear about Robert Stack, is that the man had an amazing sense of humor about himself. Just listen to this clip.
A young man, his whole life in front of him, disappears. A familiar story, yes, but this is no ordinary Joe. Joseph R. Cooper, perhaps the most loved sports figure in the country, vanished. According to Mrs. Elsie Melcher, a neighbor who asked not to be identified, Joe Cooper left his house 2 weeks ago. According to Angelique Bones, a nosy bitch who lives up the street, he took with him only a toothbrush, a wallet, a steamer trunk, and a plane ticket to Calcutta. Police theorize several possible scenarios of what happened to the man affectionately known to the world as Coop.
Well, I don't know where the hell he is. For all I care, he could be hanging by his neck in his fucking closet.
Scenario number 1. He's hanging by his neck in his fucking closet. The night before his disappearance, Coop's girlfriend had paid him a visit. According to friends, they had quarreled.
If you're looking for Joe Cooper, I suggest you look wherever you find the most heinous, blatant, and vile exploitation of children on the planet.
Scenario number 2. Coop went to Disney World.
Yes, that's Bob making a cameo as himself in the 1998 comedy Basketball, and it's pretty amazing. After he became host of Unsolved Mysteries, Bob had no qualms about spoofing his ultra-serious persona. Another hilarious role he had during the 90s was in the movie Beavis and Butthead Do America, in which he provided the voice of an ATF agent who has an unhealthy obsession with body cavity searches. It's worth the price of admission alone to hear Robert Stack say lines like, "I want you to give this scumbag a cavity search. I'm talking Roto-Rooter. Don't stop until you reach the back of his teeth." We're going to talk about Unsolved Mysteries in a moment, but it's pretty fun to look at the unusual collection of credits in Bob's filmography during the 1980s. Perhaps because Airplane showed his gift for comedy, Bob was cast as the main antagonist in Caddyshack 2. He guest starred on a 1980 episode of The Love Boat, which also happened to feature guest appearances by Betty White and the Village People. So if you look hard enough on YouTube, you'll be able to find a clip of Robert Stack gleefully applauding a Village People performance on that episode. You'll also be happy to know that Bob even crossed paths with Angela Lansbury by guest starring on a 1986 episode of Murder, She Wrote, which just seems so right on so many levels. And yes, believe it or not, Bob also provided the voice of Ultra Magnus, Optimus Prime's chief lieutenant, in the animated Transformers movie in 1986. And all I can say to that is, tonight on Unsolved Mysteries, why do Michael Bay's Transformer movies keep making money?
Make a break for cover. I'll try to unleash the power of the Matrix. Till all are one. Damn it, open! Prime, you said the Matrix would light our darkest hour. But Prime, I'm just a soldier. I'm not worthy.
But here's the most interesting credit in Bob's filmography during this time period. A made-for-TV Perry Mason movie called Perry Mason, The Case of the Sinister Spirit, which aired on May 24th, 1987. Bob plays a character who is accused of murdering a horror writer by throwing him off a bell tower in a hotel which is alleged to be haunted, and he hires Perry Mason to defend him at trial. Now, there are just so many interesting Unsolved Mysteries tie-ins here. As you well know, Perry Mason is played by Raymond Burr, who was hired as the original host of Unsolved Mysteries when it started as a one-off TV special on January 20th, 1987. After that, they filmed 2 more specials hosted by Carl Malden, and interestingly enough, Malden's first special aired on May 25th, one day after Perry Mason, The Case of the Sinister Spirit aired. The 4th Unsolved Mystery special, the first episode hosted by Robert Stack, aired 6 months later on November 29th. And it's quite interesting that Case of the Sinister Spirit starts off with Robert Stack visiting a haunted hotel, considering that Unsolved Mysteries presented its fair share of segments about hotels which were alleged to be haunted. And here's a crazy piece of trivia. The big twist in The Case of the Sinister Spirit is that Bob's character was framed, and the real killer happened to be played by Dwight Schultz, who is best known for starring in the A-Team. The very first segment Robert Stack narrated on Unsolved Mysteries was the story of Dave Davis, who was wanted for the murder of his wife, Shannon Moore, and was eventually captured after viewers recognized him from the show. Well, in 1993, Cosgrove Muir Productions, the folks behind Unsolved Mysteries, decided to produce a made-for-TV movie about the case called Victim of Love, The Shannon Moore Story. And guess who played Dave Davis? Dwight Schultz. I guess you can call this a 6 degrees of Robert Stack moment. So anyway, I'm not exactly sure how things fell into place, but Bob always said he was good friends with Raymond Burr and Carl Malden. I have to wonder if during the filming of the Perry Mason movie, Burr informed him about this new TV series about unsolved mysteries which was in development, and that's how Bob got the opportunity to be on the show. After hosting his first episode in November of 1987, Bob just seemed like such a perfect fit that they brought him back to host 3 more one-off specials over the course of the next 6 months. By October of 1988, NBC had finally picked Unsolved Mysteries up to become a weekly television series, and Bob was offered the job as full-time host. At the time, Bob figured the gig would only involve him hosting about 4 TV specials per year, but after returning home from a trip to Europe, Bob received a phone call from his agent who said, "Congratulations." Bob replied, "Oh, did I get the Chevy Chase movie?" And the response was, "No, congratulations on your new series, Unsolved Mysteries." While Raymond Burr and Carl Malden both did perfectly fine jobs hosting the first 3 episodes, they did not have the same spooky aura surrounding them that Robert Stack did, and if they had not let him host those 4 specials, who knows if Unsolved Mysteries would have ever been picked up and turned into a full-time TV series. But that's what happened, and it would ultimately turn out to be the one thing Robert Stack would become most associated with. If you're not as old as I am, and you weren't around back when Unsolved Mysteries started to take off, you might not realize just how popular it was during its heyday. For its first 4 seasons, it was among the top 20 highest-rated primetime shows on television, and wound up earning 6 primetime Emmy Award nominations for Outstanding Informational Series. Now, Bob did not approach the Unsolved Mysteries gig as just another chance to collect a paycheck, because by all accounts, he genuinely loved hosting the show, not only because it was successful, but because it actually helped people. Bob once stated, quote, "We're balancing 2 needs here. We're trying to produce theater, and we're trying to do a public service," end quote. You have to put this show into the context of its time period, because in the pre-internet world of the late 1980s, early 1990s, shows like Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted were pretty much the only outlet for solving cold cases which ordinarily did not get a lot of exposure. A good percentage of the wanted fugitives featured on Unsolved Mysteries were captured because viewers recognized them while watching the show and called in a tip. One of the most iconic phrases from my childhood was getting to hear Robert Stack say the word, "update." It was always cool to tune in one week and discover that there had been a major development for a case which I had previously seen on the show. Now, one of the more divisive elements of Unsolved Mysteries are the lost love segments, where people would use the show as an outlet to track down long-lost family members or friends they hadn't seen in many years. I know some fans don't care for these segments that much, because they're more sentimental, and a far cry from the show's true crime content. But remember, these were the days when you couldn't just type in a long-lost relative's name into Google or Facebook, so getting their story on Unsolved Mysteries was the best chance to find them, and the show had a pretty good success rate at resolving their lost love cases. I am a sucker for all the updates they showed featuring emotional reunions, and whenever Robert Stack announced them, you could sense the genuine pride and joy he felt in helping make these reunions happen. Bob once admitted that the first time he and his wife sat down to watch a segment the show did about siblings who were separated after being placed on orphan trains during the Great Depression, they were both left in tears. There was at least one murder case on the show Bob had a personal investment in: the 1988 murders of auto racer Mickey Thompson and his wife Trudy, who were both shot to death in their driveway. After Mickey's murder, Bob actually became friends with his sister, and since the killers could not be found, the case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries. It took some time, but the show kept the case alive for years by repeating the segment several times, and the man who orchestrated the murders was finally charged and convicted in 2007. Bob always had a very pro-law enforcement stance, and loved working alongside them on Unsolved Mysteries to solve cases. One famous quote he had was, "I never liked the bad guy. I never put my arms around John Gotti, Al Capone, or Lucky Luciano. For me, very simply, they were the bad guys. And when I did the Untouchables, I told them going in, if you try apologizing for any of these crumb bums, get someone else to play the part." Because only Robert Stack could pull off a phrase like crumb bums. Now, it's not really a big secret that Bob was usually pretty skeptical about a lot of the paranormal stories which were featured on Unsolved Mysteries. On a commentary track for one of their DVD sets, producers John Cosgrove and Raymond Bridgers said that when recording narration for the show's more absurd segments, Bob would sometimes turn to them and say, "Oh, come on!" One of the most iconic episodes is their 1988 Halloween special, which incidentally, I taped off a TV and became one of the most frequently watched tapes of my childhood, even though the Tallman's Ghost segment traumatized me and practically gave me a lifelong fear of bunk beds. The special featured 4 ghost stories, and Bob was apparently skeptical that an episode devoted entirely to supernatural stuff would work, but it was a rating success and showed that there was an audience for the paranormal alongside the true crime stories. Now, to be fair, I think the main reason Bob wasn't a fan of the paranormal segments is because he preferred to cover stories which actually had a chance to help people. It sounds like that whenever Bob turned to his producers and said, "Oh, come on," it was done in a joking fashion. He still acted like a complete professional, and always gave it 100% when hosting and narrating the ghost stories, and they probably wouldn't have been nearly as spooky and atmospheric without him. A series of Unsolved Mysteries DVD sets were released in 2004, only 1 year after Bob's death, and as a bonus feature, they contained a tribute to his life narrated by John Cosgrove. He said that in the 15 years Bob hosted Unsolved Mysteries, Bob never had one harsh word or serious disagreement with him. He treated everyone on the show with kindness and respect, no matter who they were, and was just an absolute joy to work with. Perhaps the only time Bob ever got truly pissed while doing the show was during an update to one of their cases. It involved two morning show radio DJs from California, Kevin Ryder and Gene Baxter, who hosted a comedy segment called Confess Your Crime, in which callers would phone into the show and confess their darkest secrets. Well, one guy actually called in to confess to murdering his girlfriend before abruptly hanging up, and this prompted a full-fledged police investigation. One woman actually appeared on Unsolved Mysteries because she wondered if the anonymous caller might be responsible for the unsolved murder of her daughter. Well, guess what? It turned out the whole thing was a publicity stunt orchestrated by the two DJs to garner ratings, and the caller was a friend of theirs. The show provided an update in which they showed an interview clip of one of these dipshits denying that the whole thing was a hoax, before it instantly cut away to an angry Robert Stack saying, "Gene Baxter and Kevin Ryder were lying." I tell ya, he looked like he wanted to reenact the scene from Airplane, where Rex Kramer barges into the airport and beats up the Jehovah's Witnesses. Anyway, Bob pretty much spent the rest of his career alternating between hosting Unsolved Mysteries and a couple of other side gigs, and perhaps the most unusual credit on his resume was a video he hosted titled The Y2k Crisis. Remember Y2k? The cover art for this video read, "Simple, rational, urgent. A plan to protect your family, money, and business." As you can imagine, these types of videos were all the rage back in 1999, as I know that Leonard Nimoy also hosted one called the Y2k Family Survival Guide. You can watch the entire Y2k Crisis video on YouTube, and needless to say, it looks pretty ridiculous today. But hey, if there's one celebrity who could successfully frighten you into believing the new millennium might send us back to the Dark Ages, it would be Robert Stack.
On January 1, year 2000, date-sensitive computer data and computer chips could malfunction and impact many aspects of our society. In the words of the space program, Houston, we have a problem. Hello, I'm Robert Stack. There are many things in our world that are confusing and unknown. Often facts are hidden to intentionally keep the authorities and the public from finding the truth. In most of these cases, a crime has been committed, and the investigators must painstakingly unravel the available clues to determine what actually took place. The outcome is clear, but the cause is undetermined. In this report, I will address something that is just the opposite. I submit that a crime has not been purposely committed, but the situation could be just as serious, as you'll discover.
So sadly, as he entered his 80s, Bob's health began to decline. When you watch the later episodes of Unsolved Mysteries, you can tell that his voice has gotten considerably weaker, but he stuck around until the show was finally canceled for good in September of 2002. If you search hard enough, you can find a transcript of a live online chat that the Lifetime channel held in May of that year, in which Bob answered questions from Unsolved Mysteries fans. It was kind of an AMA before there was Reddit. Here's my favorite exchange from this chat. A fan asks, "Do you think the chupacabras are real? I saw them on your show." And Bob replies, "LOL. That is the question of the day. First of all, I read the script and couldn't pronounce it. Then when I saw this strange apparition, flashlight red eyes, going around eating small chickens, doing weird things, I sort of washed my hands of that particular show." I gotta say, I find the idea of an 83-year-old Robert Stack typing LOL to be so adorable. Later that year, Bob was diagnosed with prostate cancer, but he underwent radiation therapy and was able to beat it successfully. However, during his treatment, it was discovered that Bob was suffering from 2 blocked arteries, but his doctor told him that heart surgery would be too risky because of the after effects of the radiation. On that tribute I was referring to from the Unsolved Mysteries DVD sets, John Cosgrove shared a story about visiting Bob and Rosemary for dinner shortly after he'd received the news he was cancer-free. He showed some amazing photographs of Bob and Rosemary looking jubilant together, and you could tell they loved each other just as much as when they originally got married 47 years ago. But unfortunately, Bob would be gone only 2 weeks later. On May 14, 2003, Rosemary discovered him slumped over in their home. He had died of heart failure at the age of 84. However, in pure Robert Stack fashion, he did not want his death to be a sad occasion. Before he died, he had told his wife he did not want a funeral. Instead, he wanted everyone who cared about him to have a get-together to celebrate his life, and that's exactly what happened. A private party was held at a Bel Air country club, which was attended by his family and hundreds of his friends, and they spent the entire time paying tribute to Bob and celebrating his life. Many people who knew him said, "Nobody lived a better life than Robert Stack," and that certainly rings true. He had a successful career doing what he loved, he had a 47-year marriage to a woman who was his perfect match, he had 2 children he adored, tons of friends who loved and respected him dearly, and when he reached an age when his acting career could have been winding down, he got a dream job hosting Unsolved Mysteries, which turned him into an even bigger legend than he already was. I know there have been talks about rebooting Unsolved Mysteries in recent years, but the problem is that filling Robert Stack's shoes as host would be an almost impossible task. I don't want to get off on a rant about the terrible Unsolved Mysteries repackaging, which was released on Spike TV from 2008 until 2010, but it was a failure in every way. They got the late Dennis Farina to host, and he was a wonderful actor, but just all wrong for Unsolved Mysteries, especially since they often had him recite Robert Stack's original dialogue word for word, and there's no way he can measure up. But regardless of whether or not new episodes of Unsolved Mysteries ever get produced, I'm just glad the entire series is now available for viewing again on Amazon Prime. It's been really neat to chat with Trail Went Cold listeners who didn't watch Unsolved Mysteries at the height of its popularity, but have finally discovered the show and bore witness to the greatness of the late, great Robert Stack. Anyway, that about brings this Patreon bonus episode to a close. I hope you enjoyed this tribute to Mr. Stack, And even though it was much different than your standard Trail Went Cold episode, I thought these bonus episodes would be a good opportunity to try something different, so be sure to leave me your feedback to let me know what you thought. So, join me next month for another Patreon bonus episode of The Trail Went Cold.